I've been in the field of consulting for a long time. For a good portion of that time, I have been an innovation consultant, and I'll tell you, it's a pretty good gig. So generally, the way my life has gone over the last 15 years is I will phone up a senior executive at one of the world's biggest companies, or someone will phone them on my behalf, and they'll say, would you like to hear some interesting ideas about innovation? And most of the time, they say yes. And most of the time, we have a good conversation, because there's always been good reasons to think about innovating. I have a very basic definition of innovation, by the way, which is that it is the creation of new economic value. That's it. New economic value for your company, and that usually means new economic value for your customers or for society. And so most of the time, senior executives want to have a conversation about innovation, and we usually have a good one. I go away, I phone them back up and say, what'd you think? They say, loved it, or most of the time they say, loved it. Really interested in what you have to say, but you know what? I got to close the quarter. So can you come back in 3 months? What happens 3 months later? There's another quarter to close. And 3 months after that, there's another quarter. And forever, innovation has been important but not urgent. And that's changing right now, literally right now. In the past 3 or 4 years, we have seen the rate of technological change accelerate and change everything around us. Change our competitive models, the business models that we can use to go to market, the directions that competition come from. And it's creating, in many ways, mayhem for the business world. So everyone knows about exponential curves at this point, I assume. Most of you have heard of Moore's Law, that over a long-term period, even before the semiconductor was invented, you can extrapolate back through previous versions of computing power, and what you will see is an exponential increase in the computing power that, say, $1,000 can buy you. That's not new news. But what we're now starting to see is that some of the technologies that have entered into our world, even in the past 10 years or so, are themselves sitting on exponential curves. The thing about exponentials is they will start at what seems like a very modest growth rate, below expectations of a linear curve, and then at some point, they cross that linear curve and seem to explode overnight. We've been living in this world for a long time with technologies like nanotechnology or AI or AR and VR, and we're just now starting to see that knee of the curve. And the thing about that is not there's all these cool technologies out there to make use of, but there are a lot of cool technologies. It's that we as humans are not wired to think exponentially. We are genetically coded to be and think linear. The way we saved our lives on the plains way back in our ancestors' history was because we could make linear, rational assumptions about what was going to happen if we entered into this dangerous area. And we just don't know how to conceive of exponential. So if I stand back here, I'm going to pick someone, if you don't tell me, if you don't shout out the answers, I'm going to pick someone to answer me. But if I stand back here and I say, I'm going to walk 30 linear paces from here, where am I going to be, roughly? Where am I going to be? Somewhere over there? Like banging up against those doors? All right, I won't pick on you again. If I walk 30 exponential paces, meaning my first step goes 1, and then 2, and then 4, and then 8, and so on, where will I be? Up there? Any other guesses? I'm sure you're all thinking to yourselves, since you're not saying it out loud, wow, Geoff, I can't even imagine. 26 times around the Earth. Which is kind of, I don't know if you guessed that or if you knew that already, but it's kind of impossible for us to conceive of what that is. That's just 30 steps. And in the step before the final one, we went 13 times around the Earth. So we as humans can't conceive of exponentials, and we certainly can't conceive of what's going to happen in our markets and our businesses as all these exponential technologies start to take hold. And that's one of the reasons why we're increasingly seeing charts like this. This is just one of many similar charts where this one happens to be the average age that a company, or the average amount of time that a company can expect to be on the S&P 500. 60 years ago, it was at least 60 years. Today, it's 20 years and falling. So the book that we wrote was actually based on, or not based on, but it was inspired by an article I wrote now a number of years ago that Harvard Business Review was nice enough to give us the cover of their magazine for. And I won't bore you with all the details of it, but they gave us the cover because we made a really interesting discovery as we were doing the research behind that. And that is, there is an optimal innovation portfolio. So I wish I had more time with you to actually explain this in enough detail, but I'll just, for the time being, ask you to just buy it. For the time being, I'll tell you what we found. But the way we set up the research is we said, look, there's really 3 different levels of ambition that any organization can have when they set out to innovate. You can innovate in their core business, which is all about optimizing what you do today for today's customers. You can stretch into adjacencies, or you can ignore your asset base and go and invent things that the world has never known that they needed before. Core, adjacent, transformational. And what we discovered in the research is, on average, for a company to out-earn its peers in the capital markets, the right ratio of spend across those 3 domains was 70% in the core, 20% in the adjacent space, and 10% in the transformational space. And for some weird reason I still can't explain, over a 3 to 5 year period, the return from that innovation system was the inverse, where 70% of what those companies were earning were from those few big, bold bets in the transformational space, 20% from the adjacent space, and 10% from the core. Thankfully, this has been a well-distributed, well-read article. The HBR called it the golden innovation ratio, and unfortunately now it's totally wrong. The reason it's wrong is not necessarily the structure, but the numbers behind the structure. So the way that we think about the innovation ambition matrix is what that last picture was called now, is using this picture up here. So all I've done on this is I've drawn a diagonal intersect from the top left to the bottom right of the previous slide that you saw, the previous picture that you saw, and declared there's basically 2 different worlds of opportunity that exist out there for any company trying to do something. Below the line, in your core markets or those near adjacent spaces, is the known or knowable space, meaning these are markets that exist today. They're customers that you can go to and say, if I did this for you, would you buy it? Would you pay me more money for it? Would you switch to me from my competitor? And you're going to get reasonably good answers back from those customers when you ask them about it. Above the line, in the so-called unknown and in some cases unknowable space, because customers can't tell you what they're looking for, you can't use the same tools. You can't go and ask for good data because you're not going to get data. There's a critical difference between these 2 different areas of opportunity, and that is that the area below the line in the unknown space is the area of risk. Risk can be measured, and therefore it can be managed. The area above the line is the area of uncertainty. Uncertainty can't be measured, and you can't manage it down. The only way you can experience uncertainty and try to contextualize it is to go do something and trigger a response from the market. For the history of business, the vast majority of the opportunity has lay below the line in the known and knowable space. You go back to my 70-20-10 thing. 7 years ago when I wrote that article, 80% of the opportunity lay below the line. If you're running a company and 80% of the opportunity is down there, you might as well just go focus on it. You can be random about your innovation and still be pretty successful. But we're living through now, on account of exponential change, a massive opportunity migration from below the line to above the line, and a shift in the world from a world governed by risk to a world governed by uncertainty. And the great danger for any going concern today, for any successful business with a successful business model, is that all of the playbooks that they've developed over time, all of the lessons that they've learned that have helped them be so successful below the line are quickly becoming irrelevant. And no one is moving fast enough to save their companies. It sounds like I'm being hyperbolic and Chicken Little, but I'm telling you, no one is moving fast enough. I see it every single day in the work that I do. And there's a good reason for that. It comes down to individual human beings. So this is a stylized picture of what it used to look like to pursue a successful long career, and the way it basically went for anyone either new to the job world or new to a job. They'll come into a company and they'll say, I want to have a long career here. Long might be 2 years, it might be 20 years. And so what they do is they embrace orthodoxy. They embrace the conventional wisdom of the way that the place operates, and they learn from their managers and from their mentors, and they follow the playbooks. Sometimes the playbooks are written down, sometimes they're just kind of the way things happen around here. And then when they meet a critical decision point where there is no obvious answer, where there's a marginal call, they will usually follow the playbooks, and because things haven't been changing that much, they usually get the answer right. But when they don't get it right, the people around them say, well, geez, you followed the playbooks, you did what we asked you to, and no harm because it didn't destroy too much value, so we'll give you a pass. And you go on to lead a long career and so on and so forth. In the world of exponentials, though, marginal calls can lead to really bad outcomes. You no longer get a pass on the things that may not have gone quite the way you wanted. And all of a sudden, you may make a decision and a competitor comes flying out of nowhere that you never anticipated before, using a technology that you have never had access to. You're not getting a buy on that. And the weird thing about us as humans is that when that happens, instead of saying, well, whoa, that didn't work very well, next time I have to do that, I'm going to do something different, we say, no, next time, I'm really going to hunker down and follow the playbooks, and I'm going to make sure I really don't deviate from what I was taught. And our managers say, well, you screwed that up, so next time bring more data, bring more analysis. And we get locked in this cycle of increasing analysis and increasing adherence to the playbooks, which are simply broken structurally. So we got to get out of that. We had a cartoonist help us illustrate the book to save you literally thousands of words of reading. For those of you in the business world, how many of you have either said or heard, I'm glad we're all aligned? Yeah, it's good until it's not. So at the heart of understanding where playbooks come from is an ability to spot orthodoxy, to be able to pick your head up in any organization, whether you're in a business or at school or anywhere, and understand just the stuff that's going on around us that is just kind of the way it is. It's the unquestioned beliefs we have about our role within a company, our company's role within the world, our industry and how it operates, our competitors and what they're likely to do. And sometimes those things are written down into playbooks and operating manuals. Sometimes they're just kind of what is out there, and it's what we've learned from our mentors over time. The key to getting any of this right and to start to understand where you can operate differently is just paying attention and saying to yourself in your daily lives, where am I doing something just because? It's the way it's always been done. It's what people believe is the right way of doing it. And once you start identifying orthodoxies, you can then start trying moves to challenge those orthodoxies. Not every orthodoxy is bad, though. I want to be very clear that there are some orthodoxies that are structural and necessary, and sometimes it's illegal, actually, to go and challenge them. Don't challenge those ones, unless maybe you want to challenge the law in a variety of different ways. But a lot of the time, orthodoxies can be challenged, and people just don't take the time to recognize them. So what we did in the book is we captured, in a number of chapters, the 7 playbooks that we see at organizations that constantly get in the way and stop people from being able to progress and operate in this unknown or unknowable space. I'm not going to lead you through the detail of all of them, but risk management systems, where you're trying to manage down risk, believing that the data that you're working with is valid, where it's actually invalid in the unknown space, and you somehow delude yourself that you're having a rational conversation about an investment decision with data that just isn't real. That's not helpful. The strategic planning calendar, this idea that you have to go through a strategy session every single year, is also, if you think about it, ridiculous. There is nothing about the strategy of how a company operates or the way markets operate that has anything to do with the passage of the Earth around the sun. The reason strategic planning happens on an annual basis is it's usually stapled to financial planning, and you need a strategy to justify where you want to spend your money. Those are the examples of some of the playbooks that we uncover in the book, and there's plenty more there if you're interested. I will say it would be tremendously ironic if a couple of guys came along and wrote a book about blowing up the playbooks and then offered a different set of playbooks instead, which we didn't do. But what we did do is we laid out 4 aspects of a mindset, or 4 principles, detonate principles, if you will, for what it means to operate as a scaled, successful company in this age as we shift to a world of uncertainty. And there's 4 different principles that I will freely admit are simply us borrowing from the world of entrepreneurs and startups, the things that come naturally to disruptors, and trying to teach those lessons as much as possible to scaled, successful organizations. There's 4 of them. 2 on the left-hand side that have to do with thinking differently, 2 on the right-hand side that have to do with acting differently. The very most important one, if I had to pick one on the page, is in the top left, which is all about focusing on driving human behavior. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the purpose of any profit-oriented entity, its job is to shift people's behavior. That's it. That is the job of any company. And what you need to understand if you're running a company is, first of all, what are all the human behaviors that make up your value chain? Not just your customers, but your suppliers' behaviors, your employees' behaviors, your regulators' behaviors. What are all those different behaviors that make up the value chain, or the way that you bring raw materials through to some sort of value in the market? Understand which ones have the most economic upside if you can change those behaviors, get someone to do something differently, and then disproportionately invest in driving those behaviors. That's it. That's the purpose of a company. And the way I try to illustrate that usually, I'll go back to my linear curve. But if you think of that as a steady state projection of what a revenue line is going to be, for example, that revenue line, that projection doesn't change unless someone somewhere changes a behavior. You will not change your forward-looking progress unless someone, it might be a customer choosing to buy your product over someone else's, it might be a supplier choosing to give you a cheaper input, but someone somewhere has to change their behavior in order for you to be successful. That's it. That should be the purpose of business. But I guarantee you, for those of you that aren't yet in the business world, and for those of you that are, the vast majority of the time in most businesses is not thinking about human behaviors. It's thinking about the stupid meeting I have to go to that's a complete waste of time, or working on PowerPoint, or working on Excel, or listening to some guy in the front of a room talk about business ideas, and it actually doesn't have anything to do with the fundamental drivers of economics of most businesses. The second one you see up here, Bring a Beginner's Mind, is actually the subtitle to the book, and it's a concept stolen from the world of Zen Buddhism. I will butcher the quote as I usually do from Suzuki's book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, but the quote is something along the lines of, in the beginner's mind, there are many options. In the expert's mind, there are few. And the whole notion behind bringing a beginner's mind is start to defy expertise. Stop believing that experts will win the day, because if the world is shifting, past expertise is not going to be valuable. And people who come into a room to make a decision based on their past experience, no matter how senior they are, will naturally close the different options you have for how you might be able to compete and do things differently. You need to be able to enable the beginner's mind, either by actually bringing beginners to the table or by forcing yourself to think that actually expertise is not going to carry the day. I'm going to blow quickly through the third and fourth so we can get to some of the Q&A. Embracing impermanence is all about, as you might imagine, just accepting the fact that no business is forever, no organizational chart is forever, no career path is forever, so stop acting like it is. And finally, in everything you do, make minimally viable moves. This is a concept stolen from the world of minimally viable products. The whole notion is boil anything that you want to do when dealing with uncertainty to the smallest possible testable step forward, and go do it and see what the reaction is. And you can course correct as necessary, and you will never fail. So that's what I have to say with my prepared remarks. I think we will now turn to some Q&A, unless I'm mistaken.
Thank you so much, Geoff. Big round of applause for Geoff, please. Thank you. Come a step forward here. Okay. So, you know, Geoff is a...
Can I just say, I was so proud of myself of landing almost exactly at the zero and not going over like I told you I was going to.
You did so well, so we really do appreciate it. So our Q&A is a little bit different from many other Q&As I'm sure you've experienced around the world. It's called Turning Point. As you can see behind us right now, we've got these 3 chairs lined up. If I can ask you to sit in the middle chair right now. And for those of you who'd like to ask a question, if you can make your way down to the side on either side here, we can then begin the Q&A. Some of you have seen our powerful mega button there, which I will use to bring the conversation
and that makes bad questioners drop through the floor.
That's
correct?
right. Actually, you're sitting over the shark-infested pool, Geoff, so you might want to move there just a little bit. All right. So, questioner 1, questioner 2. Why don't we start on the left? Over to you, sir.
Hello. Thank you for the great talk.
Absolutely.
What was the joke?
What was the joke? So the sad thing is I don't know many jokes. And all the jokes I know are not appropriate for this stage, so sorry about that.
Thank you.
Thank you again for this amazing presentation. You were talking about how companies' lifespan is going down. Now the average is 20. It's hard to believe it because when you look at companies like Google, Amazon, other bigs like this, that their share value is at $1 trillion. How could a company like that fail? Like for me, it's impossible to see it.
Well, I run the risk here of challenging now an orthodoxy about what makes business successful in this day and age, but you can't remain unprofitable forever. So there's something about the business model of some of these digitally native companies that has allowed them to acquire scale and to convince the streets and their private investors that if they can achieve scale fast enough, eventually they will dominate the world and become profitable, but not many of them are profitable. The subset of companies that are able to actually have a sustainable business model that's going to last for more than 20 years, following that model is minuscule. There's probably 5 or less companies on the planet that are able to do that. So when I am trying to think about lessons for businesses, either businesses that have been around for 100 years or businesses that have been around for 10 years hoping to be one of those behemoths in time. It's taking a look at the lessons that people who have not adapted fast enough are learning. I don't think Google or Amazon or anyone will be around 20 years from today following the same business model that they do today. It has to mature.
Thank you very much.
How you help companies to identify their blind spots, and do you have an example on that where the company had really high profits after that?
Had really high profits after identifying the blind spots?
Yeah.
Let's roll back the tape a number of years to IBM when it was going through its shift. For a very long time, IBM was essentially a supplier of computers and computer peripherals, hardware primarily. And whether it was through foresight or through the sheer number of changes that they had of CEOs, they had 4 CEOs in a short period of time who each incrementally adjusted the strategy of the company. IBM today is one of the biggest professional services firms in the world, and I bet what ended up happening at IBM in that period was they challenged the way that they had always thought about their business and how they made their profits over time. I can't tell you for sure. They certainly hadn't read Detonate then because it wasn't around, but I'm almost certain that's part of what they took into hand there. But honestly, the greatest way to identify a blind spot is identify the places where the orthodoxies are most entrenched. If you ever find a senior executive who says, this is the way things are done around here because we've done it this way forever, you know that that's a good place to dig.
I wanted to ask you about this topic of innovation, right? So how are we able to predict the level of uncertainty, the things that we don't know, but we know it's going to be super helpful for innovation for businesses?
Don't try to predict it. You cannot predict uncertainty almost by definition, and so the only way you can add contours to an uncertain space is go try something. So the secret to any sort of innovation, if you're working in that adjacent or transformational space, is get to a prototype as quickly as possible. Try to at least have in mind what the profit model is behind those prototypes, because you can be patient for growth, but be impatient for profit.
Makes
and
sense.
Go put it in the market and try it and see what the reaction is. And you're probably not going to get it right the first couple times, but at least you haven't spent so much money at that prototype phase that you can't course correct as necessary.
Thank you.
Absolutely. This is fun. Every time I turn around, there's someone new there.
It's awesome.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation. So I'm working for an innovation department here at the bank.
Okay.
And so the management requires disruptive ideas and come up with really new fields of innovation, whereas the colleagues come up with the normal, the core ideas.
Yeah.
So how would you tackle this challenge?
Well, the reality for any going concern is you have to be able to do both. Probably the most important role of innovation at any company, successful company today, is continuing to innovate in the core, because that is what's going to fund the rest of the system. But you cannot just focus on the core. You need to be able to have usually a separate innovation function to focus in that unknown or unknowable space, because you need different people, different skills, different measurement systems, different payment systems for the people that work in that space than you do for the core. And each has to respect the role of the other in how they work together as a system. Hi.
My question is, what is your suggestion, to grow a small company to something big? What is the first step?
I would say, first of all, don't read all the management books, except for Detonate. You should read Detonate for sure. But a lot of the so-called management wisdom of the past is not going to carry us in the future. I would say, at least from my vantage point, the things that were up there on the screen at the end are the reason, if you're in a successful small company, my guess is some combination of those things are things that came naturally to you or your founders originally. Don't lose that. And if you can hold on to that through the life of the company and constantly look for ways to reinvent yourself, you're more likely to be able to last for a while. There's a smallish company in the US called Edible Arrangements. They do, you know it, and do you have it here as well?
Yeah.
Okay, so the CEO of Edible Arrangements has gone public to say every 5 years he is going to blow up the business model of the company. Every 5 years. I don't know if it's exactly on clockwork, but he and the rest of the management team is going to challenge the conventional wisdom of what the company has become and turn it into something different. And that, I think, is the future of business.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
I think we need an extraordinary, large, massive round of applause for our speaker, Geoff. Give it up for Geoff. Thank you so much. That was awesome. Really, really good, great questions. Mitch, if you want to exit stage left, that's great.
Thank you.
Thanks.